The envelope had been sitting in a drawer for 23 years. Adaeze Nwosu had opened it only once, when she was 14, and her mother had taken it from her hands before she could hold it too long. Not yours to carry, her mother had said, and pressed it flat again, and slid it back into the dark of the drawer between old bills and a broken watch that no one had ever repaired. The lion in that drawing had stayed in Adaeze's memory anyway. Crayon. 4 colors. A single tree, and the animal sitting beneath it, looking at nothing in particular, surrounded by a whole blank page of empty space. She was 31 when her aunt put her name on the list. Adaeze found out on a Thursday evening, when her phone buzzed with a message from the selection committee confirming her registered entry for the ceremony of crayon. She read it 3 times. Then she walked into the kitchen where her Aunt Bola was making groundnut soup and filling the small apartment with warm, heavy smells, and she stood in the doorway for a long moment before she spoke. "You entered my name," she said. Bola did not turn around. "I did. Without asking me. If I had asked, you would have said no." That was true, so Adaeze said nothing further. She sat down at the kitchen table and looked at the pattern in the wood and tried to feel angry, and could not quite manage it. The truth was that there was very little left to try. The business she had opened 2 years ago was alive but barely breathing. The flat she rented cost more than it should. She had no savings that she could not see the bottom of. Her mother was sick in a way that doctors kept calling manageable but that looked, to Adaeze, less manageable each month. There were bills that did not stop arriving simply because you asked them to. Life had been pressing in on her from all sides for long enough that she had almost stopped noticing the pressure, the way you stop noticing a sound once it has been playing long enough. So she did not say no. She sat at the table, and she breathed, and the soup cooked behind her, and eventually she got up and went to her mother's room. Her mother, Adaeze Nwosu, was sitting up in bed with a book open on her lap and her reading glasses pushed down her nose. She looked up when Adaeze came in. She could tell, from the way her daughter stood in the doorframe, that something had shifted. "Bola entered my name for the Ose ceremony," Adaeze said. Her mother was quiet for a moment. Then she closed the book. "And you're going?" "I don't know what I'm doing." Grace looked at her daughter for a long time. She had a way of looking at people as though she could see the thing they were holding behind whatever they were saying. It had always made Adaeze feel slightly visible in ways she didn't entirely want to be. "You should go," her mother said at last. "I have nothing to bring." That was when her mother reached out and opened the drawer of the bedside table. The envelope was there now. She had moved it some years ago, when arthritis had made the kitchen harder to reach. She held it out to Adaeze without speaking. Adaeze looked at it for a long moment and did not take it. "That belongs to him," Adaeze said. "Yes," her mother said. "That is exactly why you should bring it." Crayon was not, strictly speaking, a king. He had no crown. No hereditary title. No kingdom in the historical sense. What he had was something that people had decided to call by that name because they did not have a better one for what he was. He had built his first company at 22, a logistics firm that moved goods across West Africa through routes that larger companies had said could not be made reliable. He had made them reliable. By 28 he had 3 companies. By 32 he had 8, and they were in 4 countries, and people had started writing about him in the kinds of publications that were read by other people who built things. By 35 he had sold 2 of the companies, not because they were failing but because he had learned what he needed to learn from them, and he used that money to fund 6 others. He had a compound outside Accra that covered ground enough to qualify as a small estate, and an office in Lagos that occupied the top 2 floors of a glass building that caught the light at certain hours and looked, from the street, almost like it was on fire. People came to him. That was the nature of what he had become. They came with proposals and ideas and requests, and sometimes with things that had nothing to do with business at all. 3 years ago, someone in his circle, no one could quite agree on who had suggested it first, had proposed the selection ceremony. The Alpha King, they had taken to calling him, partly because of the way he led, partly because of something in how he moved through a room that made everyone else adjust their position without being asked. And so a ceremony had been organized. Women who wished to present themselves as potential partners for a man of his standing would come twice a year, and they would bring gifts to demonstrate their understanding of who he was and what he valued. He would receive them. He would consider. It had run for 3 years and produced nothing. He had received gifts of extraordinary beauty and expense. He had been gracious about every one of them. He had chosen no one. The women who attended the ceremony were not naive. They understood what they were entering. The gifts they brought were selected with care and intelligence. They were meant to say something, to show that the woman holding the gift understood the man she was approaching. Rare art from galleries he had mentioned in interviews. First editions of books he had quoted publicly. Handcrafted items from the regions where his companies operated. The women came prepared in the way that very serious people prepare for very serious moments. They had researched him. They had thought about him. They had brought the best version of what research and thought could produce. Adaeze had done none of that. She had the drawing, and she had her mother's certainty, and she had a dress that her mother had made for her 5 years ago for a cousin's wedding. She had the letter, also, which she had found clipped to the back of the drawing when she took the envelope from her mother's hands, a short letter from Adaeze's maternal grandmother to her mother, explaining how the drawing had arrived. The primary school teacher in Kumasi had sent it. A boy in her class had left it behind when his family moved away. The teacher had kept it because she had been troubled by something in the drawing, something about the way the lion sat, separate from any background, entirely alone, in a way that felt less like a drawing of an animal and more like a drawing of a feeling. She had kept it for years, not knowing why, and eventually she had sent it to her niece, who was Grace, who was Adaeze's mother, with a note that said only, "Keep this for whoever it belongs to." Grace had kept it for 23 years without knowing who that was. The morning of the ceremony, Adaeze woke before her alarm. She lay still for a while in the early grey of her room, listening to the city beginning outside her window. She thought about walking away from this. She thought about it with genuine seriousness. She could not identify, in any practical sense, what she expected to happen. She was not a woman who believed in magic. She did not think the drawing would produce a miracle. She thought, if she was honest, that she was going to walk into a room full of women who had brought extraordinary things and stand there with her old envelope and feel, in the most complete possible way, the specific texture of her own inadequacy. She got up. She showered. She put on the wedding dress, which was a deep green that her mother had chosen because she said it was the color of a forest after rain, steady and full of life. She did not put on much jewelry. She did not wear much on her face. She picked up the envelope from where she had set it on her dresser and she held it for a moment, and she thought about her mother's eyes when she had handed it over, and she put it in her bag. Her mother was already awake and sitting in the small living room when she came out. Grace looked at her daughter, in the green dress, with the plain bag, and her expression did not change in any way that Adaeze could have described precisely. It was just the look of a woman who had lived long enough to recognize certain moments for what they were. "Go," her mother said. Adaeze went. The drive to the compound took 40 minutes through across mid-morning traffic. She sat in the back of the car her aunt had arranged and watched the city pass and tried to think of nothing in particular. At one point a child on the sidewalk looked directly through the car window and held her gaze for a long second before the car moved on. She did not know why that stayed with her. It just did. The compound gates were open when she arrived. Security checked her registration. A woman in formal dress led her through a garden that was better than any garden had the right to be, past paths edged in stone and flower beds that looked as though they had been considered very carefully by someone who knew something about beauty. She was brought to a waiting room with other women who had arrived before her. 11 of them, when she counted. More would come. She sat and waited. She held her bag in her lap. She did not look at her phone. The ceremony would begin in an hour. She breathed. The gifts in that room were extraordinary. Adaeze could see them without trying to see them. They were wrapped and boxed and cased with the kind of care that made the care itself part of the gift. A woman near the window had a long flat case in a pale wood that might have held a painting. Two women were seated with boxes on their laps that had the particular quality of things that had been made for a single purpose and no other. A woman across the room held something in a cloth of deep indigo that she kept both hands on, as though the weight required it. These were not ordinary gifts. They were the result of months, probably, of considered effort. They were saying, "I have thought about you. I have understood you well enough to bring you this." Adaeze held her back and said nothing. A woman beside her, who had neat dark hair and a composed expression and introduced herself as Caroline, looked at Adaeze's back and then at Adaeze, and Adaeze waited for what the look might turn into. It turned into nothing in particular. Caroline simply looked away again. Maybe she was too disciplined to say what she was thinking. Maybe she was thinking something else entirely. At some point a different attendant came in and explained the format. Each woman would enter the presentation hall in the order of registration. She would approach the table at the front of the room. She would state her name. She would present her gift. She would step to the side and wait while the next woman came forward. Crayon would receive each gift and each name. At the end, he might speak. He might not. The ceremony was not a conversation. It was a presentation. Simple enough. Adaeze looked at the door that led to the hall. She thought, quite clearly, I am going to walk in there and put a children's drawing on that table in front of all those women and the most powerful man in the room, and I am going to feel it happen, and I am going to have to live with having done this. Then she thought, and my mother thought it was right, and she does not think things that aren't. She held on to that. The doors opened. The first woman was called. The presentation room was larger than Adaeze had expected. It was not decorated in the way she might have imagined, no elaborate displays, no excessive ornamentation. It was a clean room. Wide. High-ceilinged. At one end was a long table, and behind it, elevated on a low platform, was a chair that was not quite a throne and not quite just a chair either. It occupied some space between the two. Two men sat at the table with open notebooks. Attendants stood to each side. And Crayon sat in the chair. She had seen photographs. Photographs had not done the work that seeing him did. He was tall even sitting. He was wearing dark clothes, well-made, nothing showy. He had a face that would take you a moment to read, not because it was blank, but because there was a great deal of careful arrangement happening behind it, and the arrangement was very good. He looked like a man who had decided, at some point, that he would not give anything away that he had not chosen to give. And he had been very good at keeping that decision. He received each gift without expression. A slight inclination of his head. A look at the object. Eyes back up. Next. Adaeze watched from the side of the room where those who had already presented were asked to stand. She watched him not change. She watched 12 women offer extraordinary things and she watched him receive each one with the same composed respect that gave nothing back. When her name was called, she walked forward. The table was closer than it had seemed from the side. She set her bag down and she opened it and she took out the envelope. It was not wrapped. It was not in a case. It was a manila envelope, soft at the corners, with nothing written on the outside. She placed it on the table. She straightened up. She said her name. She did not explain. She did not say anything else. The attendant on the left reached for the envelope. Crayon lifted one hand slightly, not to stop the attendant, exactly, but the attendant stopped anyway. Crayon leaned forward and picked up the envelope himself. He turned it over. He looked at the blank back, then the blank front. Then he opened it. He slid the drawing out slowly. He held it. The room was already quiet, but there is a kind of quiet that is simply the absence of noise, and there is another kind that is made of attention, and the room shifted from the first kind to the second kind so gradually and completely that Adaeze felt it the way you feel the moment before weather changes, in your chest, before anything visible has moved. Crayon looked at the drawing for a long time. He looked up at Adaeze. She looked back at him. "Where did you get this?" he said. His voice was even. She could not read it. She answered him honestly, speaking clearly because her voice was the only sound in the room. She told him about her mother. She told him about the teacher in Kumasi. She told him what the letter had said, about the boy who had left the drawing behind, about the teacher who had felt something in it that she couldn't name, who had kept it because she said the child who drew it looked like someone who needed at least one person in the world to hold something for him. Adaeze said nothing for a moment. Then he said, very quietly, she was not wrong. He set the drawing down on the table in front of him with a care that was different from how he had set down anything else. Then he looked up at Adaeze one more time, and she held the look, and then she stepped to the side as she had been instructed, and the next woman was called. But the room was not the same after that. She felt it without seeing it. The particular attention that had gathered when he picked up her envelope did not fully leave the room again. Something had shifted in the air, and everyone in the space could feel it even if no one spoke it. Adaeze stood to the side. She kept her face steady. Inside, she was doing what her mother had always told her to do when something large was happening. She was breathing. Just breathing. One breath at a time. Staying where her feet were, in the present moment, not reaching ahead into what any of this might mean. But her hands, she noticed, had stopped being entirely steady. 3 days passed and she heard nothing. She told herself this was expected. She told herself the ceremony involved many women and a man who had many demands on his time and his attention, and that 3 days was nothing, and that she should simply return to the ordinary work of her life. She went to the small shop where she sold handmade fabric goods, and she sat behind the counter and she talked to customers, and she moved through the days with a steadiness that she was proud of even if it cost her something to maintain. On the 4th day, a message came from a contact she did not recognize. It said that Adaeze would like to speak with her, if she was willing, and it gave a time and a location and a name to ask for at the door. She read it twice. She put her phone face down on the counter. She served a customer who wanted blue fabric for a tablecloth. She wrapped it carefully and thanked the woman and waited until she left. Then she turned her phone over and read the message a 3rd time. She replied that she would be there. She did not tell her aunt. She told her mother. Her mother listened to everything she said, and then she folded her hands in her lap and she said, "I know." "You know he would call?" Adaeze asked. "I know that drawing belonged to him, and I know that when something that belongs to a person finds its way home, it changes them." Grace looked at her daughter steadily. "How it changes them, that I cannot tell you. But something moves." Adaeze looked at her mother for a long moment. "I'm frightened," she said. It was not a thing she said often. "Of course you are," her mother said. "That means it matters." The building where she was asked to meet him was not his office tower. It was quieter than that, a smaller building in a part of the city she knew but not well, a building that had the feeling of being used for things that were not for display. She gave her name at the door and was taken to a room with chairs and a window that looked out onto a courtyard with a tree in it, and she sat and looked at the tree for a few minutes before the door opened. Adaeze came in without attendants. He sat across from her and for a moment neither of them spoke. He was looking at her the way she had noticed he looked at things he was trying to understand, not impolitely, but with a directness that didn't apologize for itself. She held the look because she had told herself she would not look away from anything in this meeting unless she genuinely needed to. "I've been thinking about what to say to you since the ceremony," he said. "I haven't known what to expect you to say," she replied. "Fair." He settled into the chair. He had that quality, she noticed, of being completely still without being tense. It was the stillness of someone who had no need to fill space with movement. "I want to ask you something, and I want you to know that there's no correct answer. I'm asking because I want to know the truth." She waited. "Did you bring that drawing because you thought it would work?" he said. "Did someone advise you to bring it? Did you calculate what it might do?" She considered the question genuinely. She had been asking it herself, in various forms, since the morning of the ceremony. "No," she said at last. "I brought it because my mother handed it to me and told me it belonged to you. I thought it might embarrass me. I almost didn't go through with it." I had nothing else to bring that was worth bringing, and I decided that an honest nothing was better than an impressive lie. He looked at her for a long time. An honest nothing, he said slowly. I didn't mean it to be poetic. I meant it literally. The edge of something changed in his expression. Not a smile, exactly. But something in that direction. I know, he said. That's why I believed it. He asked her questions after that. He asked about her mother, and she told him about Grace, about the illness, about the way her mother kept her dignity through things that would have made a lesser person. He asked about the shop, and she told him about the fabric business without dressing it up into something more impressive than it was. He asked about the teacher, and she told him what she knew, which was only what the letter had said, and she gave him the letter, which she had brought in case he wanted it. He held the letter the same way he had held the drawing. With both hands. With a care that made her understand, without him saying it, that there was something in this man that had been waiting a very long time for certain things to come home to him. She said I looked like I needed someone to keep something for me, he said, reading from the letter. Yes. He set the letter down. He looked at the window. Outside, the tree in the courtyard had leaves that were moving very slightly in a breeze she couldn't feel from inside. I was 9, he said. My father moved us 3 times in 4 years. I stopped holding on to things because holding on to things only made the moving harder. He paused. I don't remember the drawing. But I know I drew lions. I always drew lions. A pause. Because I thought they were the bravest animals. They stayed in one place. They belonged to it. Adaeze said nothing. She understood that this was not a thing that required her to say anything. I've built a great deal, he said. I've received a great deal. People bring me things because they understand my worth to them, and they want me to understand their worth to me. It's honest, in its way. This entire ceremony is an honest arrangement. He looked back at her. What you brought was the only thing in 3 years of ceremonies that had nothing to do with who I am now. I know, she said. You're not frightened, he said. I am, she said. I'm just not letting it run me. He looked at her steadily. Something in his expression was different from the composed arrangement she had seen in the ceremony room. It was not unguarded, exactly. But it was less performed. I'd like to have more conversations like this one, he said. That is not how I was expecting this meeting to end, she said honestly. No, he said. I don't think you expected anything specific, which is one of the things I noticed. She thought about that on the drive home. She sat in the back of a taxi this time, not an arranged car, just an ordinary taxi with a broken side mirror and a radio playing something old and cheerful, and she thought about what it meant that she had walked into that room and walked out of it changed, and she thought about how her mother had looked when she handed her the envelope, and she thought about a child of 9 who drew lions because he thought bravery meant staying in one place, who had then spent the next 26 years building himself into something that moved across countries and industries and rooms with the ease of a person who belonged to everything and was rooted in nothing. She thought about the drawing. She thought it must have been something, to draw that and then leave it behind. Whether on purpose or not. She thought that was probably a question she would ask him, one day, when the right moment came. She was not at all sure that she and Crayon would end up building anything together. She was honest with herself about that. One meeting was one meeting. One moment in a ceremony was one moment. Life did not hinge on single moments as often as stories suggested it did. There were many conversations that would need to happen. There were many things about him she didn't know, and many things about her that he didn't know, and those unknowns were not small. He was a man who occupied a kind of life that she had never moved inside, and she was a woman whose life was made of things he had never needed to worry about, and that distance was real and it would require something real to cross. But she also thought about the way he had held the letter with both hands. And she thought, okay. Let's see what comes next. The conversations that followed were unlike anything Adaeze had been prepared for by any previous experience of how men conducted themselves when they were interested in a woman. Adaeze did not pursue her in the way she recognized. There were no flowers delivered to her shop, no dinners at restaurants chosen to impress, no declarations of anything. What there was, instead, was a series of meetings that felt, each time, more like the continuation of an ongoing project than the performance of romantic interest. He would send a message through the same contact as before, a time, a place, and she would come, and they would sit, and he would ask her things. He asked about her life with a specificity that initially unsettled her. Not "how are you," but "you mentioned your mother's treatment has changed, how is she managing the adjustment?" Not "what do you enjoy," but "the fabric business, you said you source from 3 regions. Is the sourcing relationship stable, or are there pressures you're managing?" He paid attention in a way that felt almost structural, as though he were building a model of who she was from many small verified data points, and the model mattered to him in a way that went beyond courtesy. She asked him things too. She asked him about the logistics company, about the early days when the routes he was building had seemed impossible to people with more experience than him. She asked him what it had felt like to sell the first 2 companies, whether it had felt like loss or like something else. He considered her questions the way she noticed he considered everything, seriously, without performing the seriousness. It felt like finishing a sentence, he said about selling the companies. You don't grieve a finished sentence. You start the next one. She thought about that for days afterward. There were 6 meetings across 7 weeks. She counted them without meaning to count them. After the 3rd one, she noticed that she had stopped going home afterward and immediately telling herself that she was probably reading too much into things. After the 5th, she noticed that she was arriving to the meetings without the careful internal preparation she had been bringing to the first 2. The conversations had become the kind she didn't have to prepare for, because she had stopped trying to be impressive and he had never seemed to want her to be. After the 6th meeting, walking out into the evening, she stopped on the pavement outside the building and stood for a moment in the warm end of the air and understood something. She was not performing herself for him. She was just herself. And he kept showing up to the next meeting anyway. That was not a small thing. The resistance, when it came, was quiet and came from the side she had not been watching. She had known, in a general way, that Adaeze existed inside a world of people who had opinions about him, and that those opinions extended to questions of who he should and shouldn't spend his time with. She had understood this without needing it explained. Men in his position had advisors and associates and people who felt that their own interests were tied to his decisions in ways that gave them, in their own minds, a legitimate stake in those decisions. What she had not anticipated was how the specific quiet of that resistance would feel when it reached her. It reached her through a woman she knew slightly from the professional circles she moved in, a woman named Diane, someone Adaeze had seen at events, someone she had always considered neutral ground. Diane called her one morning and said, with a careful gentleness that was the voice of someone delivering a message they wished they were not delivering, that she had heard, in certain conversations, that people close to Adaeze were concerned about his direction. That the phrase "unsuitable background" had been used, and that Adaeze should be aware of this, because Diane liked her, and wanted her to know what was being said in rooms she wasn't in. Adaeze thanked her. She hung up. She sat very still for a while. Unsuitable background was a phrase that meant several things at once. It meant her family didn't have the money or the connections that his world expected. It meant her mother was sick and there was nothing glamorous about that. It meant her shop was small and her flat was rented and she had nothing that announced itself as significant from the outside. It meant that she had walked into that ceremony in a dress her mother had sewn and put a child's drawing on the table and the most watched man in the room had stopped, and that this made people who managed his image deeply uneasy, because they could not fit it into any shape they already understood. She did not tell Karen about the call at their next meeting. She was still deciding whether to. He could tell, she realized, that something had changed in her. He didn't push at it directly. Instead, he asked her, partway through their conversation, what she was holding back. She looked at him. "Someone called me," she said, "to tell me I have an unsuitable background." He was quiet for a moment. She watched him decide not to perform his reaction. "And what did you say to them?" he asked. "I thanked them," she said. "Because they were trying to be kind, in their way." And what do you think about what they said? She considered this carefully, the way he had taught her, without meaning to teach her, to consider things. I think they're right that I don't come from a world that looks like yours, she said. I think they're wrong that it makes me unsuitable. I think the real concern is not about me at all. It's about them, about what it means for them if you choose something they didn't advise. He was quiet again for longer this time. Yes, he said. That's all, she asked. That's all, he said. You've understood it exactly. What would Adaeze do? She thought, this is the kind of man he is. And she understood, in that moment, sitting in the small room with the window that looked onto the courtyard tree, that she had been falling toward him for some time without quite acknowledging it to herself, not because of what he had built or what he was called or what the world saw when it looked at him, but because of what happened when you put a true thing in front of him. He moved toward it. Without performance. Without the careful management of someone who has learned to protect themselves by keeping everything at arm's length. He simply moved toward it. She thought about the 9-year-old who had drawn a lion under a tree and left it behind. Who had moved so many times that holding on to things had stopped seeming worth it. Who had then spent the next decades building and acquiring and receiving and being called the Alpha King, and who had not, in 3 years of ceremonies filled with extraordinary things, moved toward any of it. Until a woman put a child's drawing on a table and said her name and nothing else. She understood, then, what it meant that her mother had kept that envelope for 23 years. The opposition in his circle did not disappear. She was realistic about that. In the weeks that followed their 6th meeting, she could feel its presence even without seeing it directly, could sense it in the careful wording of the message that scheduled their 7th meeting, in a slight change of location that she suspected was about keeping the meetings less visible to certain people. She could feel it in the way Diane sent a follow-up message, warmer this time, that felt less like information and more like a plea to reconsider. She did not reconsider. But she was honest with herself about the cost. There would be cost. She had never moved inside his world and she had no illusions about what it would ask of her if she entered it. She was a woman who sold handmade fabric from a small shop and cared for her sick mother and had spent the last several years in a quiet, disciplined life that was hers in a way that mattered to her. His world was large and loud and full of people who had interest, and those people would always be there, and she would need to be something strong and clear to stand in the middle of it without losing herself. She thought she was. She thought she had something that came from the same place the drawing had come from her mother, who had kept things that needed keeping without needing to be told why, who had looked at a child's drawing sent by a teacher in a faraway city and said this belongs to someone, and had kept it faithfully until the someone appeared. She thought that if she was going to be with Adaeze, she would need to be the kind of person who knew what things were worth keeping. Not the valuable things. Not the impressive things. The true things. The things that, if they were lost, would leave a space in a person that nothing expensive could fill. She had grown up watching her mother understand this. She thought she understood it too. The announcement was made on a Wednesday morning in a statement that ran to 2 sentences. No event. No ceremony. No public display. It said simply that Adaeze and Adaeze Nwosu were engaged, and it gave no further information. His office released it through the usual channels and said nothing further when asked, and the people who asked were numerous and persistent, and the office continued to say nothing further. Adaeze read the statement on her phone while standing behind the counter of her shop. A customer was looking at fabric on the shelf behind her. The radio in the corner was playing something low. The ordinary world was conducting itself with complete indifference to the fact that something large had just happened, and she found, standing there, that she was grateful for that. That the ordinariness of that moment was exactly right. Her mother cried when she told her. Not dramatically. Just a few tears, sitting in the chair in her bedroom, with her hands folded and her reading glasses pushed up on her forehead and the afternoon light coming in sideways through the curtain. Adaeze sat beside her and held her hand and neither of them spoke for a while. You kept the drawing for the right person, Adaeze said eventually. I knew I would know when the right person came, her mother said. How did you know it was me? Grace looked at her. Because when I handed it to you, you didn't ask what was in it. You just held it and you knew it wasn't yours and you were going to give it back. She patted her daughter's hand. That's a rare thing. That quality. Most people, when they hold something, start to think it belongs to them. Adaeze thought about that. She thought about Karen, 9 years old, drawing a lion. She thought about what he had said about lions, that he drew them because they stayed in one place, because they belonged to where they were. A child who was moved from city to city, who drew the animal that didn't move. Who left the drawing behind, maybe without meaning to, maybe because by then he had stopped believing that anything would stay anyway. She thought about the teacher who had picked it up. Who had felt something in it she couldn't name and had decided to keep it. Who had sent it on, eventually, to someone she trusted, saying keep this for whoever it belongs to. A chain of ordinary people doing an ordinary, faithful thing, holding something carefully, for a long time, without reward and without explanation, simply because it deserved to be held. She thought about what Karen had said, in their third meeting, when she had asked him what he looked for in the people he chose to keep close. He had answered without hesitation, people who know the difference between valuable and true. She had written that down when she got home. She still had the note. The drawing now hung in his home office. He had framed it himself, in a plain dark wood frame that he had chosen carefully from 3 options. It hung beside the window that looked out toward the garden. The lion. The tree. The blank space all around them. The 4 crayon colors. In an interview some months later, a journalist asked him about it. She had seen it on a visit to the office. It was visible in photographs that had been taken during a profile, and readers had asked about it. What is the drawing? The journalist asked. Why does it hang there? Karen looked at the question for a moment the way he looked at all questions, measuring it, deciding what it deserved. It was drawn by someone who understood, at 9 years old, that the bravest thing is to stay, he said. I forgot I understood that. Someone kept the memory for me until I was ready to receive it back. He paused. I think that is what the people we love do, when they are truly for us. They hold the things we put down. They hold them carefully and they wait, and when the right moment comes, they hand them back. The journalist wrote that down. She asked who had kept it. He said, a woman who believed that some things deserve to be held, even when you don't know yet who they belong to. Her name was Grace. He did not explain further. He didn't need to. Adaeze read the interview in the kitchen of the home they now shared, on a morning when the light was coming in the way it does in the early hours before the heat arrives, clean and sideways and making ordinary things look briefly extraordinary. She read the interview twice. She set her phone down. She looked at the window. She thought about her mother. About the draw. About 23 years. About a teacher in Kumasi who had felt something in a child's drawing and had decided, without any practical reason to do so, that it mattered enough to keep. She thought about all the things in the world that were put down and never picked up again. All the things that fell through the cracks between one life and the next, lost not because they were worthless but simply because no one happened to be paying attention when they were left behind. She thought about the ones that didn't fall. About the chain of attentive hands that passed certain things along from person to person across years and distances, without fanfare, without understanding why, following some instinct that said, this belongs to someone. Hold it until you know who. She thought about what it meant to be the person at the end of that chain. To be the one who finally stood in a room and said, here. I believe this is yours. She picked up her phone. She called her mother. Grace answered on the second ring, the way she always did. I read his interview, Adaeze said. A pause. Then, I know. I read it this morning. He called you Grace, Adaeze said. I heard. He said you believe that some things deserve to be held. I do, her mother said. I always have. Adaeze was quiet for a moment. Outside, a bird was doing something persistent and cheerful in the garden, repeating the same short phrase over and over into the morning. I love you, she said. I know that too, her mother said. Now go and have your breakfast. You sound like you're standing in the kitchen not eating again. Adaeze laughed. She was, in fact, standing in the kitchen not eating. She made her breakfast. She sat at the table. She looked at the light coming through the window, and at the small framed photograph her mother had given her when she moved in, a photograph of nothing important, just a street in the neighborhood where Adaeze had grown up, taken on an ordinary afternoon that no one had recorded for any particular reason. Her mother had framed it because she said ordinary things deserved to be remembered too. Adaeze had thought, at the time, that was slightly sentimental. She understood it now. She ate her breakfast. The morning continued around her. Somewhere deeper in the house, Karen's voice carried faintly as he took an early call, low and clear and steady in the way she had come to know it. She thought, this is a life. An actual life. Made from real things. She thought, my mother kept a drawing for 23 years, and it brought me here. She thought about that for a while, sitting in the morning light, with her hands around her cup and the bird outside doing its persistent, cheerful work. Then she got up. She rinsed her cup. She went to meet the day.